Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. Hi, everyone. There you are. Everyone's looking so fresh. It is such a pleasure to be here back in the city that I love, with so many people in the room that I love, so many people that I will love after this weekend. I have kind of a beautiful task today, which is just to let these two brilliant minds shine and generate some conversation. And I think our goal is to keep it organic and light. We have a really tough act to follow, Miguel. Your talk was so generous and moving for so many of us, and I think resonated with a lot of the threads of Savannah's work and Felipe's work. So I'm excited to kind of build with everyone. I write and I teach, and for me, this kind of question of history, not as something that's like still and in the past, but that's active and constantly making its way into our everyday lives, our everyday interactions, is like a core tenet. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to hear a little bit about how these two forces have activated that same kind of ethos and philosophy in expanding this idea of maybe something like art history or archival history as a public service, right? As something that is generated in real time. So for the conversation, Savannah and Felipe are going to present a little bit about their work. And then I have 3 prompts that I will kind of generate conversation with that has come out of our earlier meetings. We met twice via Zoom to kind of share ideas. And then after that, we'll kind of turn it over to you. So be good students, take notes, bonus points for asking questions. I'll pass it over to Savannah.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to everybody at ICI and EXPO. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I will start out just by giving a little bit of background into how I got into archival work, and then some contextualizing information about the work that Afro Charities is doing now, so that we have more to talk about in common, going with our theme. So, as mentioned, my name is Savannah Wood. I'm executive director of Afro Charities, which is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1963 in Baltimore. We historically have done 2 programs that are, very much within the wheelhouse of charities. So an annual gift drive and a neighborhood cleanup initiative. In the past 5 years, I moved back to Baltimore to really explore what the Afro archives are. So the Afro-American newspapers, we partner with them now. It's a 131-year-old institution, also founded in Baltimore, and we manage their archival collection. So that's just a little background. I'll get a little deeper into that in a moment. But my journey with archives really started in Chicago, which is a city, like Sam, that I love. So I'll talk a bit about that. My first job in Chicago was actually at EXPO. So it is quite a full circle to be back here right now. And through that job, I met Theaster Gates, working with with Kavi Gupta Gallery here, as basically like an assistant running around figuring out how many lights do you guys need for your exhibition, and doing that kind of work. And so it was really by chance that all of these things started to come together and following curiosity. And so through that, there were so many different projects that we worked on. And obviously, Theaster's practice is very expansive and considers archives in ways that are very interesting and were very new to me at the time. One of the big projects that I worked on was documenting the Ed J. Williams collection, Ed and Anna Williams collection, which is a massive collection of basically racist objects and documents that they had amassed over, I believe, 40 years. And so going through all of those materials, creating, essentially like a very rudimentary finding aid for that, documenting that through photographs with other people who were on staff, Sarah Pooley, Orly Koulibaly, and Siobhan, whose last name I'm forgetting right now. So that was my introduction into archives. And from there, moved back to Los Angeles, where I had been living prior, to work with an organization called Clock Shop. And it was right at the time where they had just started investigating Octavia Butler's collection at the Huntington Library and inviting contemporary artists and writers into that collection to think about Los Angeles primarily, but to think about science fiction and how this writer's influence had touched their practices. So again, this was sort of a really interesting way to engage with archives that is beyond the typical scholarly engagement, that really is about in what I've been terming non-traditional scholarship in a way, where there's contemporary artists who might not have come out of the academy, or there's contemporary writers who might be working in journalism or in poetry that's not necessarily tied to an academic institution. Some of them were, obviously, but there's a mix in there. So from that, I started thinking about, well, okay, I haven't given this part away yet, but I'll tell you now that the Afro was actually founded by my ancestors. So the work that I'm doing right now is definitely ancestral work. So 5 generations ago, my great-great-grandparents founded the Afro-American newspapers in Baltimore. It was founded in 1892, and this is the former building. So I started thinking about, I wonder if we have archives. And then I came back and was like, oh my God, do we ever have archives? And found a way to raise my own salary, basically, to be able to come back and work with this collection. So these are my ancestors. This is John Henry Murphy Sr. and Martha Howard Murphy. There's a very fascinating story about how the paper got started that I will not go into too much unless we talk about it later. But this is kind of, a document of what that business has looked like in the past. So everything was produced in-house. So if you talk about collectivity, there's all these different people with all of these different skills coming together to produce knowledge, basically, to produce these records that we now refer back to understand what Black people were thinking in the 1920s about what was happening on a global scale, or in the 1910s, or in the 1970s. All of that is really documented within this collection. And so, there's national events that are within the collection. This is Marian Anderson singing at the Lincoln Memorial, but there's also just daily life documented. So there's several birthday parties. It's really a record not only of Baltimore, but really several Black cities across the United States and even beyond that. But it's a space where other people can find their ancestors as well. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing through Afro Charities. So I'll talk a bit more about that. We're managing the collection, and keep me on time too, because I did not time this. I'm so sorry, you guys. But I am moving quickly so that we can get through it. It's a lot of history. There's a lot of material in this collection. So it's primarily photographs, and there are 3 million photographs we estimate within the collection, but there are also documents. There's letters to the editor. There are audio materials that we've uncovered. There are original cartoons, political cartoons that are still so resonant today. So these are the materials that are like the raw materials that we're working with. And so similar to the projects that I was doing with Rebuild Foundation and Theaster in Chicago, or with Clock Shop in Los Angeles, I'm thinking about who are the non-traditional scholars who need to have access to this collection. And so we're engaging people. We're doing a couple of things at once. So the collection is fairly well organized, but there's still a lot to do. We're working on digitizing some of the photographs, although we have taken a little pause for now. But we're using new technologies that are emerging to make these materials more accessible. So if you see this image, the back of it has the caption that ran in the newspaper. So in this, you have biographical information about the people who are pictured here. You have location information, where it is, the date is on there. All of this is really rich information that now we can use tools like optical character recognition when we scan the back of this to use to pull out all that data and to recognize it as a date, to recognize it as an address. And then what can you do with that? There's so many more things that we can do now that we're creating this wealth of information. So there's like the very real infrastructural work that needs to happen in terms of access. And this is, there's a short video, but I don't know how to make it play. So it's just basically showing the digitization work that we've been doing. We're photographing the front and the back of each image. We're using optical character recognition tools to pull out that data. And it's also recognizing objects. So it'll say, a cat is in this photograph, or a blouse. Jerry curl came up, which was a surprising one for me. But beyond the kind of technical infrastructure for data and access, there's also this more, access through public interpretation. And so we're working, specifically inviting artists into the collection to make new work inspired by whatever they want, really, whatever details they find that are of interest to them, and trying to facilitate their research so that they can go deeper into it. This is an example of that. Our first iteration was in 2020 with Shan Wallace and Akia Breon Brown, who were both at the time Baltimore-based artists. Our second iteration of that was with the New York-based artist Iveria Simmons. We worked with Cadist to produce a body of work with her that debuted in Paris and then went to Stockholm after that. And we're in our third iteration right this moment. So we are going to be working with 3 Maryland-based artists in this round to do a similar engagement. And through all of this, there are so many conversations being generated really on a global scale. So in this particular instance with Iveria's work in Paris, we invited other stewards of Black archives throughout Europe to come and talk about their practices and talk about the practicalities or impracticalities of the work that they're doing, what their strategic methods of sustainability are, whether they even are thinking about sustainability or if it's just like, putting Band-Aids on things where we can, because there's not a lot of resource that can go into some of these projects. So dealing with those material limitations as well and thinking through them together. So we had people representing more established institutions like the Black Cultural Archives in the UK, more itinerant, mostly online archival practices. There's one from Paris who was working on a Caribbean archive that was primarily online. Somebody representing Black archives in Sweden as well as in the Netherlands. As part of this work, we're also producing publications. We're just doing a lot. We're doing a lot with a little team. This was produced in 2020 and around the 100th anniversary of women's rights to vote in the United States. And so we looked into the archives to find examples of Black women in both Maryland and the DC area who might not have been as recognized to tell their stories and to bring them to the front, as the title alludes to. So we're taking these materials that are, very much from the past and contextualizing them within a contemporary moment. And then almost finally, one of the ways that we think is really important for engaging with this collection is specifically to work with young people as in some ways as a supplement to their regular curriculum, but also just because they need to be in here and touching these things and because their ancestors are represented in this collection as well. And so for the past 3 years, we've been working with Baltimore City youth to, explore the collection and to make new work inspired by what they find in there. So inviting them in and having them really understand themselves as researchers and that their work is important and that we want to support it. And so it's a paid program. So they get a stipend for participating. They make new work. They have an exhibition of their work. And this year and last year, we worked in partnership with a Baltimore-based organization called Muse 360 to do this project. And they've been running a program called New Generation Scholars for, I don't know the exact date. I want to say 17 years. So working with young people is hard. And they've been doing an amazing job at corralling folks. And we're just really grateful and honored to be able to participate in that with them and to open our collection in this way for kids. Okay, finally, all of this work will ultimately find a home in a building that we're currently developing in West Baltimore called the Upton Mansion, which is in the Upton neighborhood of Baltimore. It's a big project. And so the idea is that this will be the permanent home and research center for the collection, really making the collection explicitly publicly accessible for basically the first time in the 131-year history of the Afro, which is a big deal. It is a really significant collection of Black history. There's just not any other way to say that. Like, it's really remarkable. And so to be able to have a home for this collection to live in, for all of these programs to live in, will be really important. Right now, we are guests at a Maryland State Archives facility, which has been a wonderful partnership. They've been very generous with us. But it's outside of the city limits, and their hours are fairly restrictive, particularly when you're thinking about working with kids who are in school. So to be able to have our own site within the city where people can come and engage with these materials would be a game changer. This is a historic image of that site, and this is a former rendering that will be updated soon of what it will look like in the future. So that's my time. Thanks.
Thank you, Savannah, and thank you everyone for being here. I'll try to be also clear as I can and quick. So my presentation, because it's we're talking about, in my case, I'm an artist, and I've been dealing with um, how to write my own history, not only mine, but with friends. I studied in Chile in the 90s, so it's like post dictatorship. I'm part of probably the one of the first generation of artists after exactly what Miguel was talking about, the 80s in Latin America. In the 90s, we had what they call the early democratic years or transition years to democracy. And Chile was going through all this effervescence of social change, of cultural changes, of economic changes too. And so, with a group of friends just coming out of art school, we decided to create an artist run space called Galeria Chilena, which was a nomadic space with no, we just had like a little space, storage, office, and we curated and organized shows for about 2 years in Santiago, using different places, always for free. And from this history, I want to show you books because basically working with Galeria Chilena and with my friends Diego Fernandez and José Luis Villablanca, which were like, we were like the three, and we also had this sort of collective or collaborative way of taking decisions. There was no hierarchy. And at the same time, we also wanted to be a commercial gallery. We wanted to represent artists, which was something that in Chile didn't happen at the time. So having said that, from that basically that experience, we all had like, each of us had like a sort of a skill. And my skill was kind of being the nerd behind the computer and organizing information and keeping the archive sort of in order. And from that experience, also designing pamphlets, posters, different kind of publications as a way also to write our own history, because there wasn't, as also as was mentioned before in the previous talk, Latin America is very fragile and unstable in the amount of support artists have in institutional and in the commercial circuit too. So the books that I produce, which I have them here if somebody wants to see them later. This one was produced in 2010. It was in conjunction with a series of group shows that happened in different places in Europe. And the idea was to sort of show and discuss and think about this collective history that started in Chile in the mid 90s. So in the bottom image, you have the three of us, very formal, and this is sort of a collective art piece. We also created in response to an invitation to an exhibition in the Swiss Institute in New York. This is 1998. And the way, we were invited as an artist-run group to present ourselves or to present an artist. It could be a group show, a solo show, whatever we wanted. And after a lot of brainstorming and throwing ideas, I don't remember exactly how it happened, but we decided on the idea of taking a photo with the president of Chile of the time, which is Eduardo Frei Rustagla, who also represents, at the very core, this transition period from dictatorship to democracy. It was a very complicated political time too. A lot of concessions had to be made. There was still a lot of militaries and people who were complicit in the horrible things that happened in the 70s and 80s that were still in power or still in government or still doing business as usual. So we decided to instead of presenting, this also was a show in New York, which we knew that if we present one artist or group of artists, probably in the next year nobody will remember. There's so much information and so much going on in that city where I lived for 24 years that we thought it was more interesting or more efficient to present the gallery as an idea. So we wrote down a proposal, and also Chile is this way that there's a lot of the gallery also worked in this way of through social connections, through friends. Like one of the shows was in the building where Joe lived, and there was like a party room for party events. So we used that space. Another was made in a friend's house or in an empty house that we got through a friend. So a lot of this, like, kind of using this very basic economy, trying to create and make things with almost no money, no support. So we managed to get a letter and a portfolio to the president through a friend of a friend of a friend, and he accepted to take the photo with us. And this is the poster that we made. This is also before the internet. Before this is '98. Before WhatsApp, before Instagram. So, in this time, at least in Chile, it was very because of the also of neoliberalism and capitalism. And Chile is one of the places that I think you see publicity everywhere. Like there will be Coca-Cola signs here. Like it's crazy. Um, and so we decided to also, and it was very in vogue. We called it gigantografía, which is like a large print, and you will see them on the street. You see them. So we said, okay, let's do gigantografía with the president representing the gallery, and it was a poster promoting the gallery. So you have the date, and it's ridiculous. It's like since 1997, so only 1 year. And then on the bottom, on the table, you can see our address and an email and a phone number. And this was presented at the Swiss Institute in '98. And then the book was the intention of this book was to show this history of collective thinking, collective working, collective writing, collective planning, as a way to also, basically help each other. Like if nobody's going to help us, we can do it ourselves. The book is divided in two. You can take a look at it later. This first section is on purpose made with like this sepia tone to make it look old and historic. Playing with time, of course. And as an artist, I've always been interested in history, and my own work is, of course, related to history. The third book is about that. And so I have this, I don't like to call myself a researcher, but I do have a sort of a research hat I put on sometimes. And through a friend who's Maria Berrios, who's a brilliant Chilean curator and writer and a friend, I got to know this place, which is called Escuela de Valparaíso, which is it's an experimental architectural school that was funded in Valparaíso in the 50s, early mid 50s. And it's a very interesting example of just, basically thinking out of the box. Like how can you create an architectural school that's different? And the main, the head professor who was invited to fund or sort of rethink the school said, okay, I'll do it, but I'll invite anybody I want. And he basically invited poets and artists and architects to fund and think about the school, how to think about architecture in a different way in relation to space, in relation to territory, in relation to how people interact within that space, within the city. And so one example of this school, which there are many examples, is Manuel Casanueva, who's an architect that actually didn't build much, maybe 1 or 2 buildings. And he was mostly a professor in the school. And he was obsessed with sports. And he created this class, which is an experimental sport class. It came out of a course called Cultura del Cuerpo, the culture of the body. And he created this class called torneos. Torneos means tournaments. And these are basically large, very large group manifestations and competitions. So they will create a set of rules where, in this case, it's working on stilts, and you have to walk on this sort of like a caracol shape, like spiral shape. There were teams differentiated by color. I'm sorry, I made my selection very short of images. I feel terrible now because everybody has so much images. I was trying to be very concise. But you can take a look at the book later if you're interested. And basically each torneo, each competition had some kind of object or extension of the body or construction that will alterate how the body interacted with space and interacted with the other bodies, and how there was always something that kind of change how you behave in space. So in this case, stilts with those kind of velas, like cells or whatever. That, of course, if it's windy, you're affected. There were others that people were, their vision was blinded. There's a really beautiful tornado where the vision is blinded, and they had to create these helmets. And the only way to look and to see the other team and to see your team and to was jumping. So everybody's jumping, and the helmets were like move all like this. So Manuel was obsessed with sports. He was obsessed with basically this kind of, also the idea of la fiesta, of the party, of how to create these events in a very festive way. And this was a course. So this was like, to do this torneo, they will study and they will work, for a couple of months, designing the objects, building the objects, and finally making the torneo, executing the torneo. And this torneo also has, this book is also, I produced this book for an exhibition I had in Mexico in 2014 at the Museo Experimental El Eco, which is also another example of Mexican experimental architecture, very much related to art and to poetry and to dance, a building, brained or sort of thought by Matthias Goeritz. And I thought it was interesting to create this dialogue between the history, this Chilean history, and the Mexican history of Leco. This is another game where, and this, the book title comes from this game, which basically the ball, the body becomes the ball, and the ball becomes the field. So in this, like, he was also always thinking about the structures of the game, of like how, okay, in football we push a ball, but how can we create a ball where, and in this case they had to throw a person on top and then ride them for like 200 meters, and whoever get to the line first won. So he's also reversing the structure of the game. And these are all architecture students, young kids having a lot of fun. All these images are also part of an archive of the Universidad de Valparaíso that, I'm in contact with them, and they give me permission to use. And this is a third book. I've made like 20 books, so I just made a selection here. But this is a third book and this is about my work, which is textile based. My work has a very, the title is, "What Were You Thinking on the Past or the Future?" And the way I work is with this, again, the pieces are very, they look very formal. They have this first sort of formal approach. It's geometric abstraction, which has a whole history in Latin America, in Europe, and how that information sort of was rethought, remodeled, and in the Americas also, and in the States too. And the work is also architectural and also very collaborative. The way I produce the pieces, I started at the beginning. It was very, it was small scale, maybe one piece, two pieces here, and at the end, the project started growing, and I started interacting with the fabricators and to integrate basically them, their knowledge, their know-how in producing the work. I call them curtains as a way to refer to the domestic aspect of them, of how they can be made with a sewing machine, in your table, in your house, like many people work, domestically. In Latin America, maybe more. It's still very present that today, like, you have a relative that will fix clothes or maybe make clothes. So this is a project in Ecuador where I also, at the beginning, the designs were very determined, and from this point, the designs are kind of open. You can see a little sketch on the bottom. I decided not to, at this point, I decided not to decide everything myself, but to have, to keep it open so the producers could also participate in, for example, color combinations, or also suggest technical solutions. This is another example of a project for Brazil, in Sao Paulo, which is one of the largest projects I've made. And here also you can see how the fabricators are deciding color combinations, sometimes with my participation, sometimes without. And then on the right, we have a group of women who are from Osasco, which is a suburb of Sao Paulo, and they have this cooperative of embroiderers, and they taught me how to embroider. And since that project, I also embroider sometimes the work myself. The way of producing the pieces also changes. Sometimes it's very individual. I work by myself. Sometimes I collaborate with fabricators, which could be one person, two persons, and sometimes it's a workshop where I invite people to come and to work with me together producing the work. And that's it. I think this is the last image of curtains produced in the Dominican Republic, where this was for an exhibition where it was an outdoor exhibition, but I found more interesting than the space they assigned me, which was basically like this incredible, beautiful, huge garden. Uh, I was more interested in how people paint and decorate their homes, even in very humble homes. There's this sort of knowledge and energy in the use of color and form, how they, how they want to better their space, better their, they make it more lively, more interesting, and more fun. And yeah, so it's basically my presentation is through the books, and that's it. This is one more. Solentiname in Nicaragua. Oh yeah.
Thank you both so much. I am keeping an eye on time. We are great on time. Everybody's still with us, taking notes. Okay. You've given us so much to think about. And I think, there's this really interesting, there are places where your practices really meet and have these kinds of rich conversations. And one of them is around this question of like activating practices. It's something that I'm compelled by in both of your work. And it also is like a little bit selfish. One of the reasons why it's selfish is that, this last year, I had the real pleasure of working with Ellen Alderman and Theaster Gates at Rebuild, like Savannah from years ago. I got to kind of benefit from her archival work. And one of the things that we were really thinking about was like this question of activation. So what we're looking at is the Johnson Publishing Library. It was a resource, right, for journalists and page runners and copy editors that was built out of a need in Chicago. And for those of you who don't know, Johnson Publishing is responsible for Ebony magazine and Jet magazine. It's kind of this like stalwart of Black knowledge production. And Theaster is really one of the things about this library that's so amazing is that you have all these books that are just, overwhelming in what they mean to people. But what do we do with that, right? How do we make sure these objects don't just remain on the shelves? And, he was compelled by this idea of like, what happens if we ask people to take a book off the shelf and read out of it for 15 minutes, right? And it was a way to enliven the practice, make it so that these histories aren't just still on the shelf, but are embodied in real time. And, you can hear the tenor of people's voices and they tell you why, these works are important to them. And I was reflecting on this particular aspect of that year when I was thinking about both of your work as kind of activating practices. And so I'm wondering for both of you, right, in Savannah, in your case, you're taking this rich familial archive that is so central to Black history, right, to American history, and you're inviting in this next generation of folks to generate things out of that collection, right? So it's almost like compounding. It's like more material and more material and more material, right? And Felipe, in your work, with the gallery, there's almost this inverse thing happening where it's like you are taking, you're well aware that there won't be a record unless you create it. And so you and your collective are cultivating the very kind of archive that people can kind of turn to, right? But you're making it in real time. And so I'm wondering if you both can kind of talk a little bit about this practice of activation and what it means and how it's central to the way that you think about archival production, but also kind of, what history can do and mean in real time.
You didn't even reach for the mic. Okay. I'm happy to start. I love what you were saying about Felipe's practice making history, because I think and like if nobody else does it, who will? Because that literally is the thesis statement for the Black press. Far too long others have spoken for us. So this is why we're going to have the Freedoms Journal, because we need to tell our own history. Otherwise, it's going to be skewed in this way. And so you're making the thing that people will refer back to. There's also this sort of like self-historicizing that happens as part of it too. Like you're literally making the history and what people will refer back to, which comes with a lot of power and a lot of, you can edit in ways that people won't necessarily know what you did, Anyway, so I just wanted to point that out as like, there's that correlation there also. It's like you're literally making the history. And then in our case with the activation of it and the importance of bringing the history into the contemporary, I've found just through this work, like such a sense of purpose and direction by understanding my own history, which is deeply related to this publication. And because we have so many records that reflect other people's lineages and the places that they spend time, it's a way of like deepening a connection to place. And in my opinion, instilling a sense of pride in the people who work with the collection also, which is a necessary, feeling for moving through the world in a way that makes you feel like, okay, I'm a part of this place. I have agency. I can do these things. So I think about it as like, yes, engaging with the history, but also very much about like shaping your sense of self in the world. And that this collection has the ability to do that. And when you start to find those personal connections to the history, for me anyway, it makes me so much more curious about everything else. And I understand the context differently. So I might think about, like an American history class that I would have taken as a high schooler, and none of it was really hidden. Like none of it was like sitting with me in a way where I'm like, oh yeah, I really get this. But now that I have a deeper understanding of like what these other generations are and when they were born, when they died, then I have a sense of like, oh, that was 3 generations ago. What happened from there? How did we get from there to where we are now? And that personal connection helps me understand the trajectory of history, the ways that it shows up in the present. And so if we can find ways that, I mean, it doesn't all have to be so, like self-centered in that way. But if we can find ways of entering the history that we can hold on to, it's like almost like just a hold, so that we have a better understanding of the context of what happened there. And then you start to see how it unfolds over time and impacts your daily existence. So that's part of why I think the activation of it is so important and really critical, just to see how do we even get here?
I think in my case, it's a very sort of personal activation, because as I've been producing the books, and I think the first one was, Curating, we made like some pamphlets, we made photocopy catalogs. There's one really fun photocopy catalog, which is it was for an exhibition in Apex Art, and we had to decide a piece that we were going to produce. And at the end, the piece was the book with the emails discussing whatever. And it was a mix of brainstorming, art ideas, and gossip. And then there's a lot of these books that I don't have anymore, like because basically the activation is I rarely sell them. Every time I think, oh, I have a book presentation. What if I sell 10 or 20 books? And at the end, it doesn't work. And at the end, I decided to just give them away hand by hand to people that I meet. So it could be an artist friend or somebody I just met, and then I'm interested in their work. So it's also a way to exchange information. It's like instead of giving a card, I give a book. Or also I mail sometimes to curators I've met somewhere, and it's a way to follow up. And it's also a way to, now information nowadays, it's so, with the internet and websites and Instagram, everything is so quick and so fast. I have a website, of course, and you can track who's looking at your website and so on. And sometimes people look at your website for 2 seconds or 3 seconds. It's like ridiculous. And sometimes an hour, you don't know. But I think the book has a different feeling, and you can touch it. And this is also important that most of the books that I've made have a silkscreen cover. So it's like they're very sort of materially rich and sensitive. Most of them too are small editions, 50, 100. I think the maximum I've made is like 300 or 400. And then, 95% of the time I give them away as gifts. Again, some of the books I have, like there's a really special book that I made in 2013 that I only have 1 copy. And so it's also sort of a collection that's one day I'm going to find myself with maybe just 1 copy of each. And I think that's the way I activate them. It's sort of a personal touch that, giving them hand by hand.
It's, it's so compelling to think about this, the idea. It leads us so seemingly to the second prompt, which is like so much of Felipe, how you're thinking about these objects you create is about connection, right? And about creating almost like somehow the book creates these networks of commons, of like publics, right? That people who don't know each other who might share in this object that they have from you, right? There's a kind of like organic anonymity to it, right? But it exists, it's dispersed in the world. And I'm thinking about how that really touches Savannah with the idea of the newspaper, right? Which is similar. Like it's circulated, it creates people who have it in their living room are having conversations with each other and they don't even know, right? Through this object that exists. And I'm kind of curious about how that links up with this second thing that we kind of, all of us seem to be interested in, which is the idea of like, and the language is clunky, okay? But, the archive is like a public service or something, right? Something that is open and available and has this like lowercase d democratic potential or promise to it in both of your works, right? Because traditionally, we think, in a kind of white Western context, institutional context, the archive is a place where one goes to kind of receive and retain knowledge, right? It exists in these kind of ivory towers, and there is this kind of barrier to it, right? A class barrier, a race barrier, a gender barrier. And so I'm really curious about how both of you, or I guess part one of the question is like, do you connect to this term archive? Right? Does it resonate with you in your practices, in yourself? Both of you have articulated your practices as very personal explorations that almost have this ripple effect into making connections to others. And then the second thing is like, do you consider, do you imagine that part of the work is about a certain kind of like service or a certain kind of like aspirational gifting or opening up that you're doing in your work? Your first
Okay. Yeah, I think in my case, archive it's been important, and as I said from the beginning, like when we started this project with Galeria Chilena, we were like super conscious of keeping, and even like for example Joe, who was one of the members, he will, and it was a little bit obsessive too, like filming every party, every opening, and with videotaping. He has a huge collection of videotapes, which I haven't had access to it. It's like his own archive. And then I have my own archive. Like we have different sort of perspectives of the same project. So he's like, because he was also a musician, so he has like a bunch of films, about his music band, about Galeria Chilena too. I was more focused on the publications, and we will keep every press release, every newspaper clipping, like everything, like just like archiving, because we knew that nobody else will do it, at least at that time. Maybe now things have changed a little bit, but and then also in relation to my own work, I'm sort of obsessed with keeping all the drawings that I make for the curtain projects. Even photo, I document all the workshops, all the process of like production process. This book also has, for me, it was very important to show not only the installation of the work, but also the process of production, the people I work with. There's a text that I wrote here that also mentions, it's like a full list of the participants and the places and different techniques that were used. And I consider that also sort of as a growing archive, as a growing text, because as I keep producing more curtains and more projects, that text will keep growing like a wave. It keeps growing. And then, it was unconscious in a way, like how I started collecting all this information. But I think since maybe probably when I started designing the books, the more formal books, like about 14 years ago, I became more conscious of all this archive material. And then again, I I think we need to be generous. So the books, like there's maybe a few, like this is the only one that's no, I have two that's they're about my work, and then the rest is all collective. It's either me with another artist, or me with former artists, or about other artists too. From the Escuela Valparaíso, I've made 3 books. I've also collaborated, and then sometimes I also get invitations from other people to design books for other artists. So it's like not always it's my initiative. Sometimes it's also other people who ask me, "Oh, could we work on this book together?"
You asked first about the connection to the word archive, and it's something that comes up a lot. So I'm working with, I'm not an archivist. I'm not trained as an archivist. I just kind of got dropped into this. And I know that there is real science behind that, and there's real weight to the language and terminology that's there. We're working with somebody who is a trained archivist, and we have conversations all the time about how the collection that we're stewarding is actually amassed as working files for the production of the newspaper. So it's technically a newspaper morgue, which is, a terminology that's used to describe how newspapers keep their materials and refer back to them for their own purposes. And we're kind of creating an archive out of it, which is to say we're creating the infrastructure and creating the means of searching to make it into an archive that can be researched by other people outside of the internal confines of the organization. But language is so interesting and important because, as we're trying to fund the work that we're doing, and we're trying to reach certain audiences, we find that we have so many different languages that we're speaking to communicate some of the same ideas of so we have to use the word archive in some spaces. We use the word collection in some other spaces. We talk about clippings and photographs. There's just so many different words that come up that hold weight in different communities. So I do think of it as an archive that we're creating, and I also think of it as so many other things also. We've talked a little bit today about love and about spirit, and I do really think of the work that we're doing within this collection as ancestral work. And I can't stress that enough, that every time I go in there, it's like the boxes are jumping off the shelves saying, please tell my story. Please tell my story. And so we want to get... I don't want to do it yet. I don't want to cry yet. So, we have to get more people in there because we have to. So in some ways, it's a service to the public, but in many ways, it's a service to the people who are in the collection. Oh, my God.
You're going to get me going, too.
I won't look at you.
Don't look at me. I'm a Pisces. I'll let it rip, Savannah. Okay. I'm thinking a lot about how both you and Felipe are like timekeeping in this way. I think just even the way that you just described, right? That there's life in these materials there, and the life in these materials is occasions our life, and they're not just objects that exist, Felipe, you're not just making objects that there's a kind of presumed detachment from, right? Which is again, a very kind of imperial or colonial view that we make stuff and we're disconnected from that thing, right? These are kind of practices that are very much about touch and love and energy and exhaustion and fatigue and non-compensation and, all of these kinds of things that I think many of us connect with, right? It's you wake up every day, you're why did I make this life choice? And, something always falls in line, something comes into alignment. And I think one thing that for me really came into alignment, hearing you both in our first meeting together talk about your work is timekeeping, not as a linear, I love that map from earlier, not as a progressivist or linear narrative, but as this constant return that you're doing, right? Where you're examining the narratives that have been handed down and you're kind of deforming them and inverting them and queering them and doing these kinds of and falsifying them, right? And creating these affiliations. And so I'm curious about how that maps onto this kind of notion of timekeeping, which, is not I want to just again say it one more time. It's not about a capital H history. It's about almost like an improvisational relationship to like charting or blurring the lines between the past and the present and the future. And so I think like as the final cluster, I would, before we turn it to our audience, I'd love to kind of hear a little bit about like how what kind of significance this notion of timekeeping or time history, you know, all of these kinds of big terms, how that plays itself out in you in relation to the work that you do.
I definitely think of this work as multi and intergenerational. So it's certainly iterative also. So there are so many hands that work to amass this collection and organize it to the point where it is now. And then the work that we're doing in this generation is taking it a step further, making it just a little bit more legible to a public. And so in that way, it's kind of this constant dialogue with the past and thinking about what are the choices that were made and why they might have been made, what are the considerations that are, you know, in play, and trying to piece that history together through the collection itself. And I think because of that, we're also doing a better job of documenting our own processes. Well, I don't know, maybe they did a great job and I just haven't found that document yet, you know, but we're kind of documenting those processes also so that we are always thinking about a futurity, like a future generation that will be after us, because there are limits to what we can do. And it's literally the only way that we can get through the work. So otherwise we'll just be completely distraught that we can't add every single detail about this person into the finding aid, you know? And that's like, you know, that's on the technical side. And then on the, you know, just pushing this legacy forward is a whole other part of the work, which is like overwhelming and massive. So yeah, I mean, that's also a dialogue with ancestors really all the time of like, what do you want? You know? And like, I don't even necessarily ask that anymore because I'm just like, please stop telling me what you want. Please stop telling me. Like, could you please get in line? You know, is where we are right now because it's massive. Like they want a lot. They want a lot. And so we're working on it and doing the best that we can with the resources that we have. But it's just, you know, it's kind of a forever project. So I think about time in a very deep way of like, you know, we're doing our part in this generation with the full knowledge that we're not going to get everything done, but maybe have pushed it just a little bit closer to where we are hoping it will go.
Yeah, time. I was thinking that in your case, Savannah, because you're working with this, you have there's more years of, you know, time has passed in your case, so it's a different way of relating to the archive. In our case, maybe it was like a direct in the moment, like relationship to time and to archive. But at the same time, the books they flip. So some of them are a case in the 50s, then the 70s, then now, then the mid 90s. So there's also this jumping in time, like back and forward. And yeah, and then I think I already said this, but for me it's important that people also take the time to hold the book and to go through it, and that's it's almost as at least for me as important as taking your time to look at an artwork directly. Or to experience a performance or any kind of expression. And then I also wanted to say another thing that related to this idea of sort of capitalist production of like how things are supposed to be made. The gallery in Chile, we, as I mentioned a little bit, like we use a lot of social connections, friendship connections, love relationships to get things done with almost no money. And these books also are kind of made in a similar way. Like some of them will have funding from like a grant in Chile, but it's not a lot of money. Like maybe I'm talking about $1,000, maybe 2,000, and then the rest is I used, for example, all the silk screen covers were produced with a friend in Brooklyn who has a studio, and he will make the screens for me, and I will go and print them myself. Or he also had a risograph, and then we will find ways of creating, combining different printing techniques, like risograph with digital photo or offset with digital photo, just to make it as convenient as possible to in terms of production and to get and to make a nice product with that is baked. A lot of it is kind of handmade too. There's a process. So there's some points that it's like a regular printing process, and other moments it was I actually fold every cover myself, or there was even a book that we hand binded it, which also takes a lot of time. That's the book that I only have one copy. And actually, that book was launched here in Chicago in 2014. It was related to a series of group shows. No, actually, not group shows. It was a two-person show project with my ex-partner, my former wife, who's also an artist, and we did an exhibition together in Chile, in Guatemala, and here in Chicago. And that book was launched here in Chicago 2014, and I only have one copy. Yeah, that's it.
I want to jump in really quickly, just because we talked about the materiality of the book and the time spent with that. And Miguel, earlier you mentioned kind of like, I think you talked about a bodily and erotic relationship to knowledge. And that was something I definitely like immediately wrote down, because there is something so important about like your physical body occupying space and being in proximity to materials, touching them, handling them, that helps you like absorb the information in a way that can't happen on screens. And so these records that can be passed between people then become that much more valuable in the way that they impart knowledge and stick with you and like actually shape your worldview. So I just want to throw that in before we moved on.
I also like the idea that they are slowly disappearing between different places, Chile, here, Mexico, everywhere.
Thank you both. I see the time. Our timekeeper, Scott, is keeping me on time. I think we have time for a question. We might be able to push limits with two fast ones, but there's a hand right there. I don't know if we have.